so far we've taken a kind of kaleidoscopic view. We started with how much do we pay in taxes, and we ended up talking about nanotechnology and Skokie. It would be a little ludicrous for me to just summarize it. And it would be ludicrous for me to pretend that I'm going to tell you the prescription to Valhalla. But we found, as we were reading these data, there were at least 4 points that just made perfect sense to us. And so I wanted to talk about some next steps that I think are powerfully argued for by the data that we spent the last few months looking at. And the first sounds like a cop-out, but I think it's really quite important. And I'll tell you, when I saw this data, this light bulb went off over my head, and I was like, well, this is why Rahm Emanuel talks about tourism so much. But the ability to exploit tax burden really has an impact. It's not tiny and on the margin. It really has substantial and felt impact on residents' experience of the tax burden. And it's achieved by attracting investment and attracting more people into the state as visitors and tourists and guests. And this is something that is real, and the states that do it well reap very substantial benefits from it. And I think it's not to be underestimated as something that's relevant and meaningful going forward. The next category is obvious, but I just think it needs to be said. This debt thing is devastating. I don't care if you're here because you think your taxes are too high, or if you're here because you wish we were funding education more generously. It's just enormously problematic. And I guess I'll just editorialize for a second here, because nothing else that I've said was editorial. It was all entirely empirical. I'll editorialize for a minute and say, these 2 years that I've been in the House they were tough years between me and some of my best friends and most natural allies, because the way that we're going to be able to solve these debt problems is not painless or pleasant. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I didn't go into public service to cut the pensions of middle-class workers, particularly not middle-class public servants. But looking at the impact of these debt problems, and especially, though far from exclusively, the pension debt problem on our ability to, on a going-forward basis, provide services, we have to get this thing solved. We absolutely have to. And the sooner we get it solved, the better for the pensioner, current or future, the person who wants their taxes to be as low as possible, and the person who wants their services to be as robust as possible. So let me just put out a plea that we really work together and get this done, and get it done right, and get it done fairly, and get it done quickly. The next area is something else that I will tell you. I used to think this was kind of bogus. I used to think this was like a cheap, grandstandy, faux populist thing that people would say, oh, we need to have fewer local governments. But you just look at the numbers, and you look at how our property taxes take up an outsized share of our revenue, and you look at our completely anomalous number of local governments, and it's just meaningful. We're sitting here in Northfield Township, and there is a Northfield Township Highway Department that's responsible for just a few linear miles of road, and they have a budget of a couple $1 million that is basically unscrutinized. And it's only a couple $1 million, I guess, but that's happening 7,000 times. 7,000. One of the first things I did when I was first elected a couple years ago is I read a book by an academic called Chris Berry, and the book is called Imperfect Union, Representation and Taxation in Multi-Layered Government. I hope you're all writing that down. And he did a very, very systematic academic analysis across the country of the impact of having lots of different special purpose governments in the same area. And what he found is not surprising at all. He found that, well, look, if you've got somebody in charge of the parks, and somebody in charge of the schools, and somebody in charge of the library, and somebody in charge of abating mosquitoes, and somebody in charge of reclaiming water, and so on and so forth, then nobody is really accountable for the total tax bill. And the person who wants to be in charge of parks loves parks. And the person who wants to be in charge of schools loves schools. And the person who wants to be in charge of abating mosquitoes hates mosquitoes. And so they naturally have an instinct to do as much as they can without anyone being accountable for the total. And so we did all this complicated regression analysis, and there's graphs and charts and stuff. And at the end of it, he finds that there's a very, very statistically meaningful increase in total tax burden with no measurable enhancements in quality of services when you have this highly, highly fragmented structure of government. So I was talking on the phone to a friend who couldn't make it tonight, and she asked me to tell about what I was going to say. And I mentioned this, and she said, well, I'm really glad that you're so young, because taking on this issue is absolutely the work of a lifetime, and you'll lose by the end of your life, but at least you'll have had a chance to try. But I've really moved from thinking this was just sort of a cheap talking point to really feeling like this is relevant and important for improving the cost effectiveness and quality of service of the government we provide. And then finally, I feel like looking at this data really teaches us about the importance of finding a better way to fund our schools. We are an outlier in the inputs. We are unusual in terms of where the funding comes from. And though it's impossible to promise exactly what causes what, it really seems like there's fairly sound circumstantial evidence that that results in increased inequity of outcomes. And I think at the end of the day, that's just not an effective way to build a society with a rapidly growing middle class to drive sustained economic and population growth. And this is something which has been viewed as a parochial issue for a long time. And if you look at the current school funding formula, first of all, you should devote more time to just reading the school funding formula than it'll take to read Imperfect Union, Taxation and Representation in Multi-Layered Governments, because the formula itself is longer than that book. And it's more complicated, and it makes less sense. But you'll find that it's been distorted and played with over the years so as to be gamed on behalf of specific districts, on behalf of specific politicians who had an agenda, on behalf of specific chunks of the state. And if you view this issue from a purely parochial standpoint of what can we do to squeeze as much for us out of the system as we can, you're by definition creating an inefficient way to spend those resources. And here we are in this time of historically scarce resources in government, enormously pressed government that will continue to be pressed, and strong evidence, I would argue, that the inequality of educational attainment is providing a substantial drag on our ability to construct a new, vibrant, rapidly growing, broadly shared form of Midwestern prosperity. So I think it's time to really think this through carefully, to figure out a way to do it that doesn't hurt any one district, to figure out a way to do it that's fair, that's reasonable, but that really thinks through the goal of an education system, broadly speaking, translates that goal into an analysis of how we ought to distribute the dollars and do it. And I think if we can accomplish that, it'll be a major step toward building the kind of new, vibrant, broadly shared Midwestern prosperous economy that we all want. Thank you.